It's really warm in here, isn't it?
So, how many of you have ever been part of a gaming community? Raise your hand. Yes. How many of you have ever been annoyed and frustrated by your gaming community? So we're not gonna go into a long rant, but we're gonna talk about dealing with gamers. We're gonna talk about a bit about the history of gaming communities, some things that you might not know, and then we're really gonna dig into the future and what's happening, and some things that you need to know about how to take advantage of gaming communities effectively if you're in the business. So let's start with a brief history of gaming communities. Raph, when did communities start to coalesce and form around online games? What was the dawn?
The dawn of it would probably be the Plato network computer systems that ran on orange plasma screens connected across universities in the middle of the 1970s. So online game communities are way older than most people tend to realize. That was the birth of what today we call IRC, what today we call instant messaging, and what today we call forums. All started out on the Plato systems, and then many of those were adopted onto the internet, the nascent internet. It wasn't quite inter yet at the time, onto the various nets that existed.
So how did MMOs impact gaming communities?
Yeah, the Plato systems didn't have MMOs. But again, most people don't realize the first massively multiplayer games that supported hundreds of users simultaneously date back to 1978, right? So that was actually the dawn of the massively multiplayer game community. Those were called MUDs, the text MUDs. There were a whole bunch of impacts that started arising from that. MUDs, their heyday ran up through around the mid to late 1990s. Many of them are still running. Hundreds of them are still out there. But at their peak, there were tens of thousands of them running as active online game communities. And if today you are in a game guild, you can thank MUDs. If you play a game with crafting, you can thank MUDs. If you play any sort of online game that divides up into classes, MUDs totally stole that from D&D. But the RPGs, the CRPGs, didn't tend to work that way early on. A lot of that today that we see popping up everywhere, MUD influence is really significant.
So in MUDs, the community engaged within the game itself.
That's right. We didn't have the web. Like, I got started back in those days. So I've been doing this online game thing. I got started in text MUDs around 1992, which made me already late to the party. We did not have pictures on the web because we didn't have a web. There was no web. If you wanted to go find things, you used Archie and Gopher and FTP sites. So we couldn't use forums. There was Usenet, which today is like a hidden menu inside of Google Groups. They like they stole it all. It's hidden down in there. You can still find those archives. So we used Usenet as our forum system, mailing lists as mailing lists. Those haven't really changed. And the games actually typically ran forum systems inside the world.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There would be in-game bulletin boards where you could leave messages, in-game mail systems, and a host of other things. So it was a very much about having activity, community activity, be in context rather than scattered out on other sites.
Right. So what does it look like now? What's happening now in gaming communities? Where's the heat? You know, for instance, Discord.
Yeah, so we've sort of seen a gradual unbundling of this, right? When I was the lead designer on Ultima Online back in 1997. Any OG MMO players here? Yeah, cool.
The late lamented.
Yeah.
Actually, it's still running.
No, it's still running.
Still
21, 22 consecutive years running.
And players are still complaining.
I'm sure they are. I haven't logged in a while, but I'm sure they are. When we did that, we actually did imitate what the MUDs did. We had bulletin boards inside the game. They existed in each of the major cities. Players could leave messages for one another. Public information was posted there and so on. But fairly quickly, web forums started appearing, and it started migrating out. Things like Discord, things like subreddits are sort of that process of out-migration right? Where what used to be community entirely internal to the game has gradually moved outside and has been taken over by third parties. I'd go further, though, and say that not only has it migrated out to third parties, but it's migrated out to third parties whose ultimate intent and purpose is not the health of your game community, right? Like, Discord doesn't really care if your game community is in this channel or that other channel. They just want them in Discord. And so that's a really big mental shift, I think, that has happened for those of us who've been in it a long time. For people who are just coming to it now, they take it as the natural state of affairs. But it really hasn't always been that way.
Right. So what do you feel is, especially that's useful for all of us here, that is fundamentally different about gaming communities versus, say, a hobby community, a gardening community, or, you know, how to make money on the internet community, or anything else? What is it about gaming communities that's special and different in particular that we as creators, you know, need to really understand?
Well, I think in a lot, communities are communities are communities. I think that's the first thing. I think there's a lot of people want to ascribe more specialness than there actually is. But what that means, though, is that there's often not enough attention paid to fundamental principles of community building that exist all over the place. What games really let you do is kind of externalize and implement things that are supportive of game community very directly, right? So you and I worked together on Ultima Online, right, way back when, and some of the kinds of things that might not show up in a how to make money on the internet. Right? I remember the first time we were looking at screenshots of a player wedding, and you know the bridesmaids had coordinated dresses. Do you remember that?
Because of the dyeing system.
Because of the dyeing system where people could tint their clothes. Like, make money on the internet community is probably not going to do that.
Right.
But in real world communities, we totally do that, right? And so these other kinds of online communities often don't have support for what are actually natural human patterns, right? And one of the things that the early MMOs did was actually implement a lot of normal human behavior into a game, kind of for the first time. And a lot of games today actually aren't implementing these things. It's really hard to hold a wedding inside of a battle royale. Or, yeah, you can do it in creative mode. People do.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not that it's different. It's more that there's opportunity in games to better support online community and a lot of patterns. I mean, you wrote a wonderful book that did exactly this. It's called Building Community on the Web. That traced the psychology of real-world communities and how those should be replicated, right?
So thanks for the shout out.
Yeah.
Just like real-world communities, the activity that the community engages around really shapes the culture of the community. So what have you learned about how a game itself, whether it's zero-sum or cooperative, what vibe the game has, what mechanics the game has. How does that influence the community that grows up around it?
It influences it massively, and I think people hugely underestimate this, right? Okay. If you make a game that is about shooting each other in the face, you're just going to have more bad behavior, period. It's just a fact of life. You are creating an environment where there's, if it's not a team-oriented game, where there is less trust between players. If you're lucky, you can orient it around a sportsmanship vibe, and you should be actively designing your systems to help encourage the notion of sportsmanship. Otherwise, what you end up with is third-grade recess, which is not at all the same thing, right? These kinds of things, some of which are choices that we don't even realize we're making, massively impact the way in which the communities develop in the games. So I always like to say that you design your game community either by commission, intentionally, or by omission, by just letting it be whatever it's going to be. And if you do that, you're really abdicating a lot of responsibility and a lot of control, frankly. And that control manifests in a lot of ways. Like, you're effectively giving up control of your marketing message, right? You're giving up control of the public image of your product and saying, I'm not actually going to design what that is. Because that community is your frontline facing for all word of mouth acquisition, right? The second
It's your
thing,
brand.
It's your brand,
Yeah.
right? The second thing I would say, and this is something that's particularly relevant today, is that the process of unbundling and outsourcing community out to the Reddits and the Discords and whatever means you are also surrendering that control to them, right? Often it can be very difficult to manage what is your brand identity, what's your relationship with consumers out on these other sites that you don't control. You may not have full moderation powers. You may not be able to identify a troubled user and so on. It's a reality of how the internet is today, but I think we should be conscious of the fact, more conscious than we are generally, of the fact that every choice we make in our game design and our community infrastructure is an attractant or a filter to potential members of the game community.
Right. So we're talking about control and ceding control. Let's talk about user-created groups, user-driven groups, clans, guilds. How many of you have ever been in a clan or a guild, right? So you know that there you're actually giving control of your brand over to an individual who's going to then control other people. How do you think about this in your own games? I know you're designing, new games all the time. You worked on Star Wars Galaxies, et cetera. How do you think about that? What are kind of some of the pros and cons there of really deciding to empower user-created groups?
Yeah, the earliest online games actually didn't have them. Instead, we would set up guilds or clans that were predetermined sides. So think factions in World of Warcraft or something like that. And the challenge that we started running into was that a lot of types of players did not necessarily build strong emotional attachment to a given side. Communities, there's a lot of scale factors involved in communities. And there are sweet spots in terms of the number of players who can participate in what is effectively a community of trust, right? That's really what's going on. Communities are built around levels of mutual trust. And, as everybody who's read their Dunbar and pretty much any Web 2.0 boom period document knows, that network can only stretch so far before it starts segmenting into subgroups and all of that sort of thing. So we started running into the fact that, for example, the happiest guilds are often no larger than 16 people. We started running into the fact that optimal effective guild size was often around 60. And that the uber guilds, the really big guilds or large factions, started replicating a lot of bad behaviors from the real world. Okay? So for example, in the real world, societies that have around 1,500 people tend to be strongly driven by hierarchy and castes and indentured servitude and hazing rituals and all kinds of things that you just really kind of don't want, right? And it takes getting to 10,000 in the group before you start reestablishing different modes of behavior. That's bad. We started seeing these giant guilds taking newbies in and saying, all right, you're now an indentured servant, do nothing but farm gold here for 8 hours. That's your hazing. You'll do that for 6 months before we let you in, right? It's an anti-pattern, right? But it's actually a human anti-pattern. So by enabling users to create guilds at the sizes that they're comfortable with, we started enabling a return to more natural human level engagements, right? People could find trust circles of the size they were comfortable with. They could play with just their family members or just their friends from college or whatever it was. That turned out to be super important. And then over time, what we've found is, for example, democracy is not a thing in groups that size. Groups that size are held together by a forceful personality who's the person who actually schedules the party, makes sure everybody has food, organizes the bus. You all know this person, right? Right? It turns out, remove that person, the guild goes away. Right? And they're usually not the head of the guild, actually.
Oh, really?
They're usually the second in command. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So
Just like a company. The CEO doesn't do that stuff. Right?
So Group size matters.
Hugely.
And quality of leadership matters.
It matters because it's about culture, right? This is about establishing a culture that a given group, an affinity group, feels comfortable in. And that leader sets the tone. You can have I'll just give you the example of a sports team. The leader of a sports team might very well be fairly autocratic, demand that people show up to practice on time, and be very rigid about it, be very demanding. But that unit, that social cohesion, exists for a very instrumental purpose. If you try running your family picnic that way, your cousins aren't going to show up anymore, right? They're like, oh my God, stop scheduling all of this, right? And we've all had this kind of experience. So it's super important to not only enable people to build the cultures inside the communities, but also provide the tools inside the game for these different kinds of communities to exist, which includes, can you do things like scheduling? Can you do things like, a sports team versus a family picnic? One of them needs a logo. The other one kind of doesn't, right? So providing tools like that allows and empowers players to form the kinds of communities that work best for them.
So on the group size front, if any of you are creators, developers, this is a really important topic. Bigger isn't always better. Dan Cook is another game designer we're both close friends with. I worked with Dan to create a paper on Dunbar's layers. Turns out Dunbar's number, it's not the whole story. There's a bunch of layers, and there's really key things that happen at 5, 15, 30, 70, as well as 150. And you can find that on Twitter. And if any of you want it, I will post it after this talk on Twitter. I'll repost it. Just follow me there, Amy Jo Kim. It's mind-blowing. It's so important, and it's so great. And it will give you really juicy thoughts and ideas and guidance if you're interested in leveraging this for your own development.
Yep. Yeah, search for the Project Horseshoe. That's
28, yeah.
Project Horseshoe and Dunbar layers.
Dunbar's
pop
layers.
Up.
So
and actually, I worked on, simultaneously, I worked on a paper called The Trust Spectrum, which was also almost exactly the same sort of stuff.
Where can they find that?
And just Google the trust spectrum, and it also not only walks through the layers, but also gives you design guidelines for game systems for differing levels of trust, and even the outline of a metrics system so that you can track trust levels within the gameplay among your players.
Awesome. You guys should look that up. So trust is a real theme of what we're developing here, and we only have a few more minutes. But you can't have any kind of community without trust. And if you do have that and you're able to do it, you get something that's way stickier than without it, which is really the big why of why you'd want to do it. So Raph, what is the big opportunity for entrepreneurs and business people who are thinking about including, gosh, we have this much budget, this much resources.
Sure.
Should we include games? What's the big opportunity
I'm gonna,
for gaming community?
Yeah, I'm going to make a radical statement. Okay, you all know how there's this game like Clash of Clans. Think it's pretty successful? Agree? Yeah? Yeah? I think it's probably underperforming by about 10x. How much Clash of Clans fan art do you see? Anybody read Clash of Clans fan fiction? Anybody know somebody who cosplays Clash of Clans at Comic-Con? If the answer is no, then it has an under-designed community feature set. Okay? Because that is what community drives, is passion, is creative content on the part of community participants. And those folks are often pretty far out on the spectrum of direct engagement. But that is the pattern we see, right? Your game is starting to drive a community to the day the first strategy wiki launches, right? And it keeps going outwards. These days, fandom engagement is so critically important. And I actually think the entire mobile segment has been handicapped by the fact that the only way we have to talk to our users is in the review section, which is a terrible channel for community building and building the trust relationship between a developer or publisher and an end user. Okay? So I actually think it's massively underexploited.
So what's a mobile developer to do?
get on the PC. I think the answer is really you want as many touch points with your community as possible. Find them where they live. That may be on mobile. One neat thing about mobile is it's a communications device. Maybe we should actually use that capability more. If that means going back to the old ways and building your community features into the game, where I know how to meet other Clash of Clans players, it's in Clash of Clans, that might be the right answer for mobile developers.
Interesting. All right, so boom.
Boom, that says 0.
Do
so
we have
I guess
time
we're done.
for Q&A, or is that after?
Probably not.
We will, but let me see if there's any questions right now. Does anyone have a question or a story they want to share?
No pressure. Going back to the clan leader and that strong personality driving and being the supporting influence that glues that group together. It's been my experience that having a female in that role has always led to a more stable, more reliable, and more enjoyable experience, and building more of a tight-knit family group than having a male in that same role. Has that been your experience?
Statistically, that is correct. Why?
Because females rock.
No.
Yeah, exactly. We're like, no, actually, I've noticed that a lot too. There's some great male guild leaders, but I've noticed exactly the same thing. I think some of it is, honestly, they have time and they care about it. I think some of it is familiarity with that role culturally and just in their own lives. I also think that there's a certain, there's something about being able to, there's sort of a softness around the female leading it that combines nicely with the hardness of, you have to be kind of hardcore to make your guild work, like to gather them together. You have to have some hardcore in you. But when you mix that with a kind of gentleness, that's a really attractive combination. So at the same time, us females don't want to be like always given all the emotional labor, right? Because we usually are. So it can be really nice when there's a pair, like the first in command and second in command. But let me ask you this: do you have a theory about why that is? What do you think? I
was actually going to say the exact same thing. My current clan leader is a teacher for grade school kids, so she's all about organizing and tracking and keeping people in lockstep and encouraging them to be participating and all that.
Yeah, I think what that also really strongly points up is that if you have created a culture for your game, be it on Discord or on Reddit or somewhere else, where you're effectively saying no girls allowed, then you're going to have trouble building communities. And communities, I got to tell you, what statistics show community strength is more than 80% predictive of retention. Like, it is the single most controllable thing, more so than your game design, that can drive retention. And of course, retention drives revenue. It's all about area under the curve.
I came for the game, but I stayed for my friends, right? You've probably all experienced that.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions?
We're into negative time now.
All right. Thank you all for coming.